Patrick Hutzel from Intensive Care at Home, where we provide tailor-made solutions for long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies and otherwise medically complex patients by improving their quality of life, and where we also provide tailor-made solutions to hospitals and intensive care units, reducing the cost of an intensive care bed by 50% whilst providing quality care. In last week's blog, I talked about the false economy and no quality of life, keeping long-term ventilated patients in ICU for longer than needed. You can check out last week's episode by clicking on the link below this video. In today's blog, I want to look once again on the quality aspect when it comes to looking after long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies in a home care environment. So today's blog post is looking after ventilated patients with tracheostomies at home is like flying a plane. You can only do it with skill and expertise. In today's blog, I want to focus once again on the quality aspect when it comes to looking after long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies at home. After having worked in intensive care for 20 years, I have a deep appreciation of how much training doctors and nurses need to go through and complete before they can master their skill and their profession. Looking after ventilated patients in intensive care with a breathing tube or tracheostomy is a skill that can't be learned, let alone mastered overnight, and it takes theoretical learning as well as many hours in practice in intensive care to perform this skill safely and competently. In fact, it's like flying an airplane. You only want an experienced pilot do it in order to fly you safely from A to B. Pilots and their crews are going through lengthy and sophisticated checklists before they depart the airplane, and pilots have done years of training and many hours of flying airplanes under supervision before they can fly an airplane independently. Airlines train their pilots to manage emergencies and know what to do if there are any unforeseen circumstances and turbulences. You wouldn't ask the steward or the stewardess to land the plane safely in case an engine breaks down, or would you? You wouldn't just pick people off the street and ask them to fly an airplane without any training, or would you? Looking after ventilated patients takes years of practice and highly specialized training. Therefore, flying an airplane is very similar to looking after ventilated patients with breathing tubes or tracheostomies. You wouldn't just pick people off the street and ask them to look after a patient on life support, or would you? Hospitals, intensive care units, as well as our organization Intensive Care at Home, doesn't just pick people off the street to look after highly vulnerable patients on life support with ventilation and tracheostomies, because it takes many years of highly specialized training, many years of practice in order to become competent. That's what looking after ventilated adults or children with tracheostomies is. Those highly vulnerable patients are on life support and thankfully can be done at home now safely with the right support structure, accreditation, and highly skilled and highly qualified staff. Remember, the pilot that has years of training or experience can land the plane safely in an emergency. That's what highly specialized, highly skilled, and highly experienced doctors and nurses do when it comes to ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies. They can manage, troubleshoot, prevent, and therefore get a patient safely from A to B, and they can also manage the emergencies which inevitably come up and therefore keep patients safe at all times. It still boggles my mind that some organizations offer to look after ventilated patients with tracheostomies with unqualified staff, such as support workers or registered nurses that never worked in intensive care or pediatric intensive care. That's exactly like flying an airplane without a pilot. A crash is waiting to happen, and we have certainly seen it in practice when support workers or registered nurses without ICU experience look after ventilated patients. It boggles my mind how some organizations can take a ventilated adult or child with tracheostomy home with untrained and unskilled staff, basically letting them perform tasks that could kill a patient in a heartbeat because they are on life support. In a hospital, ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies need to be in specialist areas such as ICU, pediatric ICU, or at least on specialized ventilation weaning units where the skills of an ICU or pediatric ICU nurses are available and where ventilator competent medical staff can oversee the care being delivered against best practice standards. Once again, it takes many years of intensive care training to become competent and highly skilled to safely look after ventilated and tracheostomized adults and children, just like flying an airplane takes many years of practice and training. In order to make a smooth transition from intensive care to a home care environment for ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies, one also needs to make sure that the skills and expertise needed in a home care environment are readily available. It is important, therefore, that quality standards remain very high and on a similar level compared to hospital intensive care units in order to get ventilated patients with tracheostomies home safely and eliminate the need for a burdensome and expensive stay in intensive care. So what are the quality standards needed at home for ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies? Well, the quality standards needed are very similar to hospital intensive care and are therefore a no-brainer. So ICU or pediatric ICU nurses with a minimum of 2 years ICU or pediatric ICU experience are needed to ensure they had sufficient exposure to ventilated patients with tracheostomies and are therefore competent to manage those patients 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year at home. Next, it also needs a doctor who is an intensive care specialist or an anaesthetist or a respiratory physician overseeing the specialized intensive home nursing care delivered. So you might wonder, where is the evidence? Well, I'm glad you've asked. The evidence is in the mechanical home ventilation guidelines, where the evidence is there that the only safe way to look after ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies at home is with ICU and pediatric ICU nurses. The guidelines are published on our website, and I put a link below this video in the written version of this blog. And if you are watching this on YouTube, just click on the link below this video. That'll get you to our website where you can access today's blog as well as the mechanical home ventilation guidelines. The home mechanical ventilation guidelines are a result of best practice and evidence-based practice after having provided intensive care at home nursing services for over 20 years in Germany. Because our model of intensive care at home is a model based on the successful German model, we exclusively work with critical care registered nurses who have a minimum of 2 years ICU or pediatric ICU experience in order to meet our clients' safety and quality standards. In fact, we are currently employing hundreds of years ICU or pediatric ICU nursing experience in order to make a smooth transition from ICU or pediatric ICU to home for our ventilated clients with tracheostomies and otherwise medically complex patients. Also, in the United States, many patients go from ICU to LTAC, also known as long-term acute care facilities, only to end up in facilities that are not geared to look after ventilated patients with tracheostomies. LTACs work with unqualified RNs that have no ventilator experience, and we have literally people begging us to help them get their loved ones out of LTAC and at home with our service. It's another sign that looking after ventilated patients with tracheostomies needs the skills of ICU or pediatric ICU nurses and doctors, period. One of our first clients a few years back with 24-hour and 7 days a week, 365 days a year ventilation and tracheostomy had regular readmissions back to ICU after he was looked after at home by support workers with no formal training. It was of no surprise to us that he needed frequent ICU admissions because he couldn't be safely managed at home on life support without the skills of ICU nurses under the umbrella of an accredited intensive home care nursing service. I also put a link to that case study that we documented after we had worked with this client. Also, if you are in a situation where you're thinking of taking your loved one home, or if you're a hospital or an ICU and you're looking to send your patients home on ventilation, you also need to look for accreditation and licensing. So anybody who's looking after ventilated adults and children at home needs to have similar rigorous quality standards than hospitals and ICUs or pediatric ICUs have. Anything less is once again like flying the airplane without a pilot. Therefore, we go through annual accreditation, and therefore our service is open to transparent screening by a third party in order to maintain our high quality standards. You can look up our accreditation and certification for intensive care at home by clicking on the link below this video. We have therefore built years and decades of intellectual property when it comes to the delivery of intensive care at home nursing services, including but not limited to ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies. Thank you for watching this video. And if you want to find out how we can help you to get your loved one out of intensive care, including palliative care or long-term acute care, or if you find that you have insufficient support for your loved one at home on a ventilator, or if you want to know how to get funding for our service, or if you have any questions at all, please send me an email to patrick@intensivecareathome.com. That's Patrick, P-A-T-R-I-K, @intensivecareathome.com, or call me on one of the numbers on the website. Also, have a look at our career section. We are currently hiring ICU and pediatric ICU nurses for clients in the Melbourne metropolitan area and in South Gippsland, Victoria. We are an NDIS, TAC and DVA approved community service provider in Australia. Also, have a look at our range of full service provisions at our service section. We have also been part of the Royal Melbourne Health Accelerator program for innovative healthcare companies previously. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog. This is Patrick Hutzel from Intensive Care at Home, and I'll see you again next week in another update.